أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا وعظيمنا وحبيب قلوبنا وشفيع نفوسنا أبي القاسم محمد
اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد
وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين المكرمين المنتجبين. أما بعد، فقد قال الله تعالى في كتابه الكريم وقوله الحق: بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الذي خلق الموت والحياة ليبلوكم أيكم أحسن عملا وهو العزيز الغفور. صدق الله العلي العظيم.
اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي. السلام عليكم جميعا ورحمة الله وبركاته. There was once a man who was walking through a jungle, and as he was walking he heard that there were some sounds behind him. So he turned around and he saw that there was a lion stalking him. Now, he did the natural thing that somebody does when they see a lion behind them, and he starts to run. But the lion chases after him, until as he's running he sees in front of him there is a well. Knowing that he can't outrun the lion, he dives into the well, and he holds on to the rope that is in the center of the well. And the lion is outside circling around the well. He holds onto the rope tightly for dear life. But when he looks down, he sees at the bottom of the well there is a great big python with its mouth agape, ready to eat him. So he holds even tighter to the rope. But when he looks up, he sees that there are two mice, one black and one white, which have now run towards the rope, and they have started to nibble away at it. So he tries to move the mice away by shaking the rope, until eventually he hits the side of the well and he feels something sticky on the wall, and part of it goes into his mouth. And it tastes delicious. It's honey. And when he tastes this, he thinks, oh, I'll have some more of that, thank you very much. And he starts to take more and more honey from the walls of the well. He forgets the predicament that he's in. He forgets the lion that is circling around the outside. He forgets the python at the bottom. And he forgets about the mice that are eating away at the rope. Until eventually, the mice have done their work, the rope snaps, and he falls down into the jaws of the python. You'd be glad to know the next thing that happens is this man, he wakes up. Okay, it was a dream. But he goes to an alim and he asks for an interpretation as to what has happened, what he has seen. And the alim explains to him that that lion which was chasing you was the angel of death. And it will chase you no matter where you go, you'll never be able to escape from it. And the python that was at the bottom of the well, it was your grave. And no matter how fast you run, no matter what you do, you will always end up inside of your grave. And that rope, it represented your life. And those two mice, the black and white mice, they represent the days and the nights that nibble away at your life. But oh Shaykh, what about this honey? What was the honey on the side of the well? And he explains that that honey, it represents the pleasures of this dunya. That we get so lost in chasing after the pleasures of this world that sometimes we forget that we are being chased by the angel of death. And we forget that eventually we are going to end up in our graves. Now the reason I'm telling you this story is because the underlying theme of all of these talks has been that we should aim to fix ourselves before we aim to fix the world. And over the nights we've looked at a couple of different ways that we can eliminate some bad diseases of the soul, and how we can try and chase after certain virtuous characteristics. And one of the most important ways in which we can motivate ourselves to move in the way of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is to be cognizant of death, is to be aware of the fact that we are mortal. Now, in the culture that we live in Western culture and in most cultures in general, you find that death, it is taboo. People don't want to talk about it. right? And if you take an atheistic framework, let's say more specifically an empiricist's approach to the way that the world works and to life and death, then it's no wonder that they don't want to talk about it. Because as per a naturalist's take on the world, we are accidents. We are merely the result of a concoction of atoms that have come together against impossible odds from an explosion that happened 13.7 billion years ago that has culminated into me as a human being today. But in the same way I came as an accident, I will leave as an accident. And life almost becomes a joke, which ends in death. Because no matter what I do in life, everything is worthless. Because even the other bags of molecules that I help out, they will end up with the same fate. And even the universe itself will taste death, whether it is the big freeze, the big crunch, or whichever is forecasted to happen. And there's some controversy regarding showing death in children's cartoons as well, as a result of this, because it is so taboo. I remember as a child, one of my favorite movies was The Lion King. It was 1994, I believe, it came out. Now I hope everyone's seen The Lion King, because I'm going to spoil it here. But we're 24 years after the fact, so it's fair game. In The Lion King, there's a scene where the great wise king, Mufasa, in trying to save his son, he ends up being trampled by a stampede of, I think it was wildebeest. Stampede of wildebeest. And Simba, who is his young child at the time, he goes up to Mufasa's dead body. And he says, "Come on, Dad, let's go." And the scene, especially as a kid, that's really traumatic, right? Simba is trying to get him to move. He's biting his ear, he's pushing him, he says, "Come on, Dad, let's go." And then Scar comes afterwards and makes it a million times worse. But when people sometimes they see these scenes in children's cartoons, they object. And they say, why should we subject our children to this sort of this imagery? Why should we remind children of death? Let them keep their innocence. But the problem is, well, from a psychological perspective, it's actually quite beneficial to put these within ration in children's cartoons as well, because it makes them aware as to what death is. It helps them so that when they are to face a death in their family, God forbid, then they will be more prepared to understand what it truly entails. And one of the intriguing things about death is that it represents one of the extremes of the human experience. When you analyze cultures or people throughout history, one of the most amazing things to observe is how people react under the extreme conditions. When they are subjected to a certain set of circumstances which are beyond normal, the way they react is something which is quite fascinating. And death represents the epitome of these examples. I'll give a couple of historical examples and a few contemporary examples as to the way that human beings have tried to come to terms with the idea of death and the cessation of existence. I think we've all known, and especially the kids probably studied this at school, that the ancient Egyptians, they would mummify the bodies. They'd apply various different bandages and salts, so on and so forth. They'd remove the internal organs of the body, the liver, the heart, and they'd put them in special jars, which had the heads of various different gods. They'd stick a hook up through the nose, take out the brain, because they didn't need that. And pharaohs would they'd be put in their pyramids, and the idea was that they'd wake up in the other world with everything that they had been buried with. And this was their approach to death. Let's take it one step worse, is there was an old Indian practice that was seen among some circles of Hindus, known as sati. And this practice entailed that when a man died, he was cremated on a grand pyre. And when he was being burned, the wife was expected to run and jump onto this fire and immolate herself. And again, the idea was that a good wife would not want to live after her husband had died, and she would have to burn herself alive that she could be with him in the afterlife. The British, when they arrived, they were horrified by this, and they stamped out this tradition. So it's not practiced today. Let's take it one step worse. Again, historical. We're keeping it historical. In Papua New Guinea, there were certain tribes who, when somebody died in the family, you would eat their bodies. If not the whole bodies, then part of it. Because the thought process behind this is that you are what you eat. So if you eat somebody who is close to you, then they'll continue to live on in yourself. Again, thankfully, officially, at least officially, this is not practiced anymore. But it shows that death is one of those things that human beings find it quite difficult to react to. And when we look around the world today, from a contemporary lens, we find that this fascination continues. If we look at Zoroastrians, they're not fire worshippers, by the way, before anyone says that. They were one of the first monotheistic faiths, and they continue to thrive today, particularly in parts of Iran and around the greater Middle East. And when somebody dies in the Zoroastrian tradition, the body it's viewed as unclean. And after it has been reviewed by a dog, ideally with spots above the eyes, it is then taken out into the sun. It is baked in the sun, and vultures are allowed to come down, and they rip open the body, they eat everything from inside, and then the remainder is burnt, and it is pushed down. Thank you. And it is swept away into a central well. And that's where the remains are kept. And this is how they deal with death. There's a Sedlec ossuary in the Czech Republic, which is visited by hundreds of thousands of tourists a year. And what makes this church so special is that the church is decorated entirely with human bones. Between 40,000 to 70,000 human skeletons have been used to decorate this church. And the most grand part of this church, the grandest decoration, is the chandelier. So it's a massive chandelier that contains at least one of every single bone in the human body. And the idea from the monks that built this, it has quite an interesting history if anyone's interested. But the idea behind it is that it was supposed to remind the monks of death. And finally, the Sulawesi, don't know how to pronounce that, but this tribe of Indonesia, they believe that when somebody dies, their soul doesn't leave their body until a water buffalo has been sacrificed at their funeral. And for that reason, when someone dies, they're considered as if they're still alive. So what does that mean? For practical purposes, it means you treat them as if nothing's happened. So you dress them up, you offer them food, you offer them drink, you take them with you when you go on holiday, you talk to them, you have conversations with them, they don't speak too much. But this is the idea. So they're supposed to be with you until the water buffalo is sacrificed, and they move on. And this is just scratching the surface. There are so many examples out there of the ways that different human beings have interacted with death. Because death, in many ways, it represents an abyss. It is a horizon beyond which very few have ever returned. And certainly in the modern world, we can't point to any examples where people have come back. I know people talk about near-death experiences, but there are no objective, measurable findings whereby people have gone over the edge and they've come back, at least not outside of Hollywood. So what is the Islamic perspective concerning death? Well, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He summarizes it in this verse that I recited at the beginning from Surah Al-Mulk, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, "It is He who has created death and life in order to test you in the best deed, and He is exalted, the mighty and the forgiving." And what's quite intriguing about this verse, and many other verses in the Quran that talk about death, is that Allah mentions the creation of death before He mentions the creation of life. He tells us that we were dead, then He gave us life, and then we will die again. So there's a particular emphasis throughout the Quran that is put upon death. And He identifies also from a philosophical perspective, something which is quite important, is that it is only through an afterlife and through judgment that ultimate justice can be seen. Because if there is no judgment, if there is no accountability, then there is no real reason why a maverick within society cannot chase whatever morally relativistic position he wants to take. That is to live in a socially Darwinistic perspective, to chase after whatever whims and desires he has in the world. But with judgment, then we know that whatever we do will be accounted for. That if we are one of those people who engages in haram acts, then we know that we will face it. What does Allah say in Surah Zalzala? فَمَنْ يَعْمَلْ مِثْقَالَ ذَرَّةٍ خَيْرًا يَرَهُ وَمَنْ يَعْمَلْ مِثْقَالَ ذَرَّةٍ شَرًّا يَرَهُ. That anyone who does an atom's weight of good will see to it. There'll be recompense. And anyone who sees an atom's weight of bad will also see to it. So in this connection to the akhirah, as death functions as a doorway into the next world, it gives this life meaning. Because this temporary life, which would otherwise be purposeless, is connected to the eternity, and that gives us purpose. And ultimately it's connected to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But the approach that Islam takes about death is quite a reasonable approach. And I think it is best summarized by Imam Ali salawatullahi wa salamu alayhi. He says, work for this world as if you will live forever, but work for the hereafter as if you were going to die tomorrow. And this is a beautiful summary. This is one of the most fantastic summaries of the religion of Islam that you can find. That Allah doesn't say, and this is something we visited a couple of times, particularly on the night where we talked about a positive outlook, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in Islam, He doesn't want you to give up the dunya. He's not saying that you have to be an ascetic who goes and lives in a cave his whole life. In fact, monasticism is shunned. Rather, we plan in the most intricate fashions to try and create a paradise on earth, and then by doing so we will have earned our paradise in the akhirah. And that will be for an eternity. This world, it is a matrix. And we are told, there's a hadith that tells us that man is asleep. When he dies, he wakes up. So death really is the doorway from this dream world into the real world. And Islam places an emphasis on remembrance of death. Not that we get lost in depression and negative thoughts about it. Not that we should be macabre and solemn all the time. But that we are cognizant of death. We are aware that it is here. That is why it is the sunnah of the Holy Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa alihi. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa alayhi Muhammad. That we visit the graveyards. Because then we see where our final resting place will be. It is recommended that we have our kafans in a place in our house where we can see it. Again, that we are reminded of death. And some of our ulama even, they would buy graves and they would lie down in their graves sometimes in order to remind them that this is where I am ultimately going to be. And that is one of the reasons, one of the many reasons why we also send gifts to our marhumin. To those who have passed away, we recite things like Surah Al-Fatiha, or we recite prayers in there so that they can get the rewards for it. We give money to masajid, we give money to madrasas in their name that they can get this reward. Why? There's a lot of different reasons, but one of the important ones is that it keeps our connection with those who have passed. Because sometimes when someone dies in the family, God forbid, we become much more aware of death. We become much more aware of Allah and we become more religious. But it's kind of like Hajj, right? When people come back from Hajj, they're so religious, right? MashaAllah, they've completely changed. They're a new person. But give it a couple of days, give it a couple of weeks, give it a couple of months, and you'll find most of the things, they'll go back to the way that they were before. And it's a similar thing with death. We see somebody die, and we're suddenly reminded, oh, I'm mortal, I need to do something with my life, and then give it a few days, a couple of weeks, maybe a few months, and then we go back to the same way that we were before. But the marhumin, they wait. There's one tradition that tells us that the marhumin, they gather on the night, on Thursday night, so the eve of Jumu'ah. And they visit our houses and they're waiting for a gift. Have my loved ones left behind me a Surah Al-Fatiha? Maybe a donation, something that I can take that can help me in my akhirah. So there's so much emphasis placed on the remembrance of death. But why? Why is it that there's so much emphasis? Well, the first reason is because in life there is no certainty such as death. That there's very little you can tell to someone that you know with absolute certainty other than death. We introduced the three levels of knowledge as per Islamic philosophy a couple of nights ago, that the first level of knowledge is to be told that your house is on fire, God forbid, but that's the lowest level of knowledge. The second level of knowledge is to see your house is on fire, and the third level, which is yaqeen, is that you're in the house and you feel the heat of the flames. And that is the third level. So with death, we're kind of on the first level. We know it happens, but it's sort of something that happens to other people. It's something that happens over there. It doesn't really happen to me. So by remembering death, we remember the saying of Allah in the Holy Quran, that every soul shall taste death. كُلُّ نَفْسٍ ذَائِقَةُ الْمَوْتِ. And the second reason is because by keeping the end in mind, we can focus whatever it is that we're going to do with our lives. Stephen Covey, in his 7 Habits for Highly Effective People, a book I've referenced a couple of times during these talks, his second habit of the book is begin with the end in mind. And he begins the chapter with a little exercise, and let's try and reproduce it here. I want you all to close your eyes and just imagine for a moment. You are at the funeral of a loved one. Again, may Allah protect us from this. But you are at the funeral of somebody that you love, someone who you are very close to. And you're walking into the masjid. And as you walk, you see on one side, you see the car that has brought the dead body. You look on the other and you can see there are some people who are mourning, some people who are crying. And you go and you talk to some, and you share in the pain of having lost, but also the joy of having known. And as you enter, you see all of the people lining up for Salatul Mayyit. You see the dead body at the front. Now you're walking up to this dead body. You look down at the dead body and you realize it's not one of your loved ones. It is you. And that is our fate. And that is a certain fate, that we will look down and we will see it ourselves. Now continuing with this, if we look around, now there will be 4 speakers that go up to give a talk about us, who we are as human beings. One will be one of our family members. One will be one of our friends. The third will be someone from work. And the fourth will be from some organization that we used to help out at. Hopefully there'll be a fourth one, right? Some volunteer work or charity or something. If not, maybe only 3. So what happens? They each give their own talks. Now, what would we want them to say? We would want them to say that we were a great husband or a son or a daughter or a wife or whatever, right? We want them to sing our praises. Our friend, we'd want them to say that we were loyal, that whenever they needed help, we were there for them, right? And at work, we'd want to be someone who was reliable, not someone who, when they found out they were working with them, they go, "Oh, darn, it's not this guy again." And there are people like that. When you start working, you see it, and you know it, and you try and stay away from them. And finally, we'd want the fourth speaker to say something about how sedulous we were in God's work. Can we control what they say? At this point in the analogy, when we are dead, there's nothing we can do. But now that we are alive, we have complete power over it is what they're going to say. We have complete power. We can decide. How? Not by sending them a script, but by living our lives in a way that they can't help but praise us, and that they can't help but love who we were. That is why Imam Ali salawatullahi wa salamuhu alayhi, he tells us in Nahjul Balagha, live amongst the people such that when you are alive, people flock to you. They seek your company, they want to be with you. And when you die, they mourn over your death. And again, what a wonderful summary for our aspirations in life. Live your life in a way that when you are alive, people flock to you, and when you are dead, people mourn over you. And death has an interesting impact on the psychology of the human being as well. Has anyone heard of the Nobel Prize? It's quite a famous prize, right? Everybody's heard of it. And they give a prize in a number of different disciplines, and it represents the epitome of human achievement. That it celebrates the best that human beings have managed to accomplish in the last year. Do you know where this prize came from? It was started by a man called Alfred Nobel. And he was a very rich man. He invented over 300 different unique inventions, which he patented, and was very successful in life. But his most successful invention of all, if you want to use that term, was dynamite. He was the inventor of dynamite, which was a new explosive which was much more stable and than its predecessor, which was nitroglycerin. Now, he didn't mind. He thought maybe that this dynamite will lead to an end to wars, right? Because he sort of naively envisioned that maybe you could blow up a whole army in one go, so nobody would ever want to go to war again. It's a very naive approach. But he wasn't aware of his legacy until his brother Ludwig died. When his brother died, his own obituary was published. An obituary, it's an article about someone who has just passed away. And newspapers, they have them in store. For anyone who's famous, they'll have it in store just in case that person dies, that they can publish it the next day. So it was his obituary that was published. So it's an interesting experience, right? It's almost like this Stephen Covey analogies come true, that he is seeing what people will say about him. And what was the headline? What was the headline of his obituary? The merchant of death faces his own death. And the article, it was a blistering attack on who he was as a person. One of the lines, I'll just quote one line, and the whole obituary is available online. He says, Dr. Alfred Nobel, who became rich by finding ways to kill more people faster than ever before, died yesterday. He was understandably shaken. Is this how I'm going to be remembered? The merchant of death who made his fortune by killing? And it completely changed his psychology. And he invested his fortune into building this Nobel Prize, which has come to fruition in the way that it has today. So remembrance of death, it can change who we are as people, if we begin with the end in mind. And by being cognizant of death, it teaches us that life is ephemeral. Life is fleeting. It goes by very quickly. There are a few stories in the Holy Quran that indicate this clearly. I'll mention one. Surah Al-Baqarah, verse 259. The whole story is in this one verse. It is the story of Nabi Uzair alayhi salam. He's walking through a town and everything is broken. It's in ruins. And he just thinks to himself, oh, subhanAllah, I wonder how Allah would bring this town back to life. Just out of interest. Now he's walking on one side he has his donkey and he has some food supplies with him. When he says this, when he thinks this, he falls asleep. And he doesn't know how long he's fallen asleep for, but when he wakes up, he looks around and he sees the whole city is bustling with life. The whole place has been rebuilt. And he looks around and wonders, wow, what's going on? But he looks to one side and he sees that his donkey has long since died. And all that remains tied up next to him is a pile of bones. But when he looks at his food, even the grapes are still as fresh as if they have just been picked yesterday. And Allah communicates to him and asks him, O Uzayr, how long is it that you think you have been asleep? And his response is intriguing. He says, قَالَ لَبِئْتُ يَوْمًا أَوْ بَعْضَ يَوْمٍ. Maybe I was asleep for a day, or maybe less than that, maybe a part of a day. And it transpired that he had been asleep for 100 years. And that is how quickly the time passes by us. There's another story that Allama Majlisi, he records in Hayat al-Qulub, that Nabi Nuh alayhi salam, he lived for at least a minimum of 950 years. 950 is the number that we get in the Holy Quran. But the traditions tell us that he lived on after that as well. So in this tradition, Allama Majlisi says he lived for 2,500 years. When it is time for his death, the angel of death approaches him, says, Ya Nuh, it is time. Nabi Nuh, he's standing in the sun. And he says, Oh Malik al-Maut, could you just give me one moment so that I can walk from the sun into the shade? Malik al-Maut says, okay, fine, you have just about enough time. So he takes a few steps until he is in the shade. And he turns to Malik al-Maut and he says something which pierces the soul. He says, O angel of death, let me tell you that the entire time that I have lived upon this earth, these 2.5 millennia, they have felt in their duration in the same as me walking from the sun into the shade. That he lives for much longer than any of us can even imagine. And yet still the entire sum of his life, he says it feels just like a few moments that it took him to walk from the sun into the shade. And that is the ephemeral nature of life. That is how life passes us by. But we try and be aware of the time that ticks by remembering death. And time is the ultimate currency. Time is the currency, the ultimate capital that Allah has given us. Now, what you'll find nowadays in particular, people will say, I'm too busy, I don't have time. Whatever it is, they want to improve their physical health, and I don't have time. They want to improve their religiosity, I don't have time. They want to be better to their family, they want to be more kind human beings, I don't have time, I need to do this, that, or the other. But the actual fact of the matter is, all we have is time. This is what Allah has given us. And at the end of the day, when Malik al-Maut visits us, then our judgment will be based on how we took this time that Allah gave us and where we allocated it, where we put it. You know, some people, unfortunately, they don't come to the majalis of Imam Hussein alayhi salam. And they say, well, again, same issue, I don't have time, I got work tomorrow, my kids have got exams, or they have a tuition, or swimming, or whatever it is. But how is it that we can be so naive that we think that when we come to give our condolences to Lady Fatima al-Zahra alayha salam, that we will be in loss? And when we are aware of death, we also come to the realization of this hadith from Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. It's a very famous tradition in both Sunni and Shia books. I'll quote it from Sahih Muslim, book 42, hadith 7058, where the Holy Prophet says, the world is a prison for the believer and a paradise for the disbeliever. Now, I just want to clarify here that when we're saying believer and disbeliever, just like when Allah talks about the kafirun in the Quran, we're not saying someone who calls themselves a Muslim versus someone who's not a Muslim. Because someone who's a Muslim, they may not be a mu'min. They may call themselves a Muslim by name, but they're horrible people. Or they may pray and fast and whatnot, but they're rude to their family and to their friends. So they're a Muslim, but they're not a mu'min. And then there are people who don't necessarily call themselves Muslims, but they have love for Allah, whether they know it or not, even if they don't believe in God. And they are good human beings. And Allah is the judge as to where they will end up. So I'm not making a black and white distinction as to whether someone labels themselves a believer or a disbeliever. So in this hadith, the Holy Prophet, he He is distinguishing the fact that for people who live in this world, as a mu'min, this world is their prison. And for the one who has rejected Allah's message and chased after his own desires, this world is their paradise. A man approaches Imam Ali salawatullahi wa salamuhu alayhi. And he disputes this hadith. He says, I don't believe it. The Prophet was wrong. The Prophet wasn't correct. Imam Ali says, what do you mean? He says, I am a disbeliever, and I have chased after whatever desires I've wanted in this world. But my life is hell. I have no pleasure in life. And yet your Prophet tells me this is my paradise? And look at you, Ya Ali. You may face difficulty, but you have itmi'nan in your heart. You are content with life. So how is this your prison? Imam Ali alayhi salam, he smiles, he says, look, the hadith, there's nothing wrong with it. The Prophet spoke the truth. Compared to your akhirah, what awaits you, this is your paradise. And compared to my akhirah, even this itmi'nan is nothing compared to what Allah has in store for me. And this is when we appreciate the reality of death. There's a poem that I came across which demonstrates this point. And again, if you'll forgive my Urdu pronunciation, कौन कहता है कि मौत आएगी तो मर जाऊंगा, मैं तो दरिया हूँ समंदर में उतर जाऊंगा. That who says when death comes my way that I'll be finished, that I'll die? Who says that? No. Rather, I am like a river that is waiting to re-enter into the ocean. And that is a beautiful analogy for the way that death is perceived in Islam. That we are away from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And through life we are coursing towards Him. And when we die, it is not the end, but rather it is just the beginning. When we are reunited with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But don't we fear death? Well, the fear of death, to a certain degree, a part of it is due to the unknown, but part of it is due to how much we deserve to fear death. Because if we live pious lives and we're good people and we haven't wronged anybody, then why would we fear death? Again, the world is a prisoner for the believer. But if we've lived nasty lives, or we have wronged people, or we haven't paid our wajib, zakat or khums, or we haven't kept our fasts or whatever it is, then what lays in store for us? And that increases the fear of death. Harun al-Abbasi, who was one of the caliphs, he approaches Bahlul one day. Bahlul, he was a very close follower of the Imam of Ahlebait, and he pretended to be a madman in order to escape persecution. Harun approaches Bahlul and he asks, "O Bahlul, what will it be like on the Day of Judgment? What will it be like when I am crossing the Sirat, the path, the bridge, which takes me to either paradise or towards hellfire?" Bahlul says, "That's easy. I'll show you. So he asks for someone to bring a fire, and on the fire he puts a pot of boiling water. And on top of the boiling water he puts a plate, some sort of covering which can withstand a human's weight. And he says, the way that the Sirat will be like when we stand on this plate. And we stand on it, we say what we eat, we say what we drink, and we say what we own." So Bahlul says, "I'll go first." He jumps up on the plate, he says, "I am Wahab ibn Amr. I eat bread, I drink water, and I own these clothes." And he jumps down. He says, "Harun, it's your turn." So Harun al-Abbasi, I don't know why he jumped on, but he did. He jumped on top of the plate, and he starts saying, "I am Harun, and I drink this, and I drink that, and I drink this, and that." And he jumps down, and his feet are burning. And Bahlul says, "Oh Harun, you haven't even gotten past what you drink. Why is it that you've jumped down? You can't even take this little bit of burning from this plate. How will you survive on the Day of Judgment?" So if we are someone who is distant from Allah, then we indeed do have something to fear. But again, remember, Allah is forgiving. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, there's no sin so big that He won't forgive. There's always a way back. There's always a way to move forward. So we don't have to continuously live in fear of death. And the opposite is also true. So if we are pious individuals and we live our lives on the way of Allah, then we have nothing to fear about death. There's a wonderful little tradition in Hayat al-Qulub, again by Allama Majlisi, that it was time for the angel of death to collect the soul of Nabi Ibrahim alayhi salam. The angel of death, he approaches Nabi Ibrahim and says, "Look, time's up, let's go." And Nabi Ibrahim, he's Khalil Allah, right? So he's the friend of Allah. That's his title that Allah has given him. And he says to the angel of death, are you here to take my soul? The angel of death said, yes. Allah has sent me. Can I take your soul? Nabi Ibrahim says, no, absolutely not. You go back to Allah and tell him that what kind of a friend kills his friend. So the angel of death says, okay. He says, Allah, this is what your Khalil has said. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he says back to the angel of death, go back to Ibrahim and say that if he is truly my friend, surely he'd love to come and see me. For what kind of a friend hesitates to visit their true friends? And Nabi Ibrahim alayhi salam, he smiles, he says, sure. I'm okay. And it's almost like he's engaging in light conversation with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. For this is Ibrahim alayhi salam. What does he have to fear? And in death, in remembering death, we find one of the most brilliant motivators, one of the best ways to get us moving. Because we're going through life, we're not aware of time going by, we're on autopilot. Right? It's like sometimes when we drive, we're going through because we're so used to driving, right? You're moving the gears up. I guess nowadays there's a lot of automatic cars out there, but whatever it is, the movement of the car, we're so used to it because we do the same thing over and over again, that you sit in the car and sometimes you don't even know what's going on and you're at your destination. You've arrived. You didn't even have to think. And the time went like that, okay, unless you were stuck in traffic. And we do the same thing with life. We're going through on autopilot and we don't realize it. And as a result, when we don't challenge ourselves, when we don't challenge our intellect and learn new things, when we don't challenge our experience and go out and experience the world and see new things and do things we haven't done before, then we get lost in this routine. We're on autopilot. We're just going along until eventually, oh, it's time for my death. That we wake up, we work, we eat, we sleep, and that's it. There's an old parable that there was a mule that would work very hard for its master. So someone went up to the mule and asked, oh mule, why is it that you work so hard in order to make this wheat, to grind the wheat? It pulled this large piece of stone that would grind wheat. And the mule said, it's obvious, because I work hard that my master will feed me. And the interviewer says, sensible answer. And then the interviewer comes back another day and sees that the mule is eating food. And he asks the mule, why is it that you're eating? He says, isn't it obvious? I'm eating so that I can have energy to pull the wheel. And this is the cycle that we find ourselves in. We work to eat, we eat to work, and that's it. And then one day we wake up dead. God forbid. But that is the cycle of life. But by remembering death, it snaps us out of this trance, and it turns off autopilot for a moment. And that gives us the chance that we can think about how we change. There is a story involving Nabi Dawood alayhi salam, which is recorded in Surah Sad of the Holy Quran, verses number 22 to 24, where Nabi Dawood, he had committed something called the Tark al-Awla. Now in Shia theology, infallibles, none of the prophets or imams, they never sinned. They never committed adhan. Now they could commit mistakes, or they could stray from the best possible option. That's what Tark al-Awla means. Taraka means to leave, and al-Awla is from the first, right? So it means that they did something, but it wasn't the best thing they could have done in the situation. It wasn't a sin, but it wasn't good. This is in contrast to our brothers in the school of Ahl Sunnah who believe that prophets could sin. So Nabi Dawood alayhi salam, he is king of his nation, and he looks after certain disputes. So people will enter the court and they'll say, I have this dispute with this person, can you give a judgment? And on one occasion, Nabi Dawood, he lets his emotions get control of him. Okay? He doesn't actually act it out, but he does something wrong. So someone comes, he says that, look, I am a hard-working person, and I just have one sheep. And I work really hard, and this gives me my sustenance. My neighbor has 99 sheep. He lives in so much ease, and yet he is so sadistic that he even wants to take my one sheep away from me, and then I'll have nothing. Now you hear this kind of a story, and that greed, it boils the blood, right? So Nabi Dawood alayhi salam, he reacts, and he condemns the other person before he listens to his side of the story. And again, it's in Surah Sad, verses 22 to 24. And Allah reprimands him. He says, this is not worthy of a prophet, because he didn't listen to both sides of the story. Now Nabi Dawood alayhi salam, he feels really guilty for what he has done. So he goes out and he walks amongst the plains and the mountains, and he is asking for forgiveness for what he had done, because better was expected from him. Until he happens across Nabi Hizqiyal alayhi salam, who is living in a cave. And he asks Hizqil, can I please enter? And Hizqil says, you've done Tark al-Ula, maybe later. But Allah says to him, look, he made a mistake, whatever, let him in. So Nabi Dawood, he enters. And again, this story is in Ayn al-Hayat by Alama Majlisi. So he enters into the cave and he speaks to Hazrat Hizqil. And again, Nabi Dawood's heart is full of remorse because he has very high standards. It's like when a student always gets an A star and suddenly they've just dropped to an A. They haven't failed, they've not committed a sin, but they could have done better. So his heart is full of remorse. And he says, Ya Hizqil, tell me, you live in this cave and you're devoted to Allah. Have you ever thought about committing a sin? And he says, Astaghfirullah, never. Never has this even crossed my mind. So he says, well, have you ever considered maybe being proud in what you have done? And Hizqil alayhi salam says again, no, never. Never thought of it. But then he asks, oh Hizqil, have you ever thought about enjoying the pleasures of the dunya? And Hizqil, he replies, this one? Yes, this one I have. Because everybody does. And Nabi Dawood says, well, what do you do in this situation when you are tempted by the joys of this world? If we go back to the original analogy, when we are being completely distracted by the honey that is on the side of the well, what do you do? So Hazrat Hizqil, he says, when that happens, I enter into this cave and I read what is written here. He takes Nabi Dawood alayhi salam with him. They go inside of the cave and they see there is a skeleton that is lying on the floor. And next to the skeleton there is a tablet, which is like a large piece of metal or of stone. And in the tablet it is inscribed the following. I am Arwal bin Shalam. So it is the epitaph of this person whose skeleton is there. I am Arwan bin Shalam, and I ruled for 1,000 years, and I established 1,000 cities, and I had 1,000 wives. But my condition after all of that is this, that I have nothing as a bed but this dust. My pillow is a stone, and my body is the dwelling place of insects and vermin. Whoever sets their eyes upon me should know that no matter what they think this world gives them, they should never get lost in the attractions of this dunya. Death is that great motivator which keeps us awake and switches off autopilot. And we also find in the Holy Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us that death, though for us it is not the end, for the shuhada, for the martyrs in the way of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, death, they continue to live in a different fashion. Not that they've gone to the akhirah just yet. Allah tells us in Surah Al-Baqarah, verse number 154, وَلَا نَقُولُ لِمَنْ يُقْتَلُ فِي سَبِيلِ اللَّهِ أَمْوَاتٍ بَلْ أَحْيَاءٌ وَلَكِنْ لَا تَشْعُرُونَ. And do not say about those who have died in the way of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that they are dead. No, they are alive. And they are alive such that they even receive sustenance from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And what better tafsir can we find of this verse than the event of Karbala? What better example can we find of people who have been aware of death and they give away their lives in the way of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala?